All right, Chip, should we go ahead and get started?
Probably get started. So, hi everyone. Small group here, but I think that'll be great. That means you'll get questions answered and things like that. Couple just quick ground rules if you can. We're going to try and keep the cameras off. We're going to shut ours off here, and actually I'm going to make mine go away. Just to hold down bandwidth, and for anyone that might be using something like an iPhone or working off of broadband, it'll be a little bit easier. And if you've got questions for now, just relay them into chat, and Sarah will interrupt, and we'll get your questions asked as we take a look at the ALP. So, quick introduction. I'm going to let Sarah introduce herself, and she's going to handle the introduction for Elizabeth as well. My name is Chip Clark. Some of you have met before, some of you have not. I am the owner of Assisted TechWorks, which is a product distributor out of Virginia for PRC and Saltillo products. I've also been involved in all sorts of different consulting in the industry and travel around the country teaching right now a masterclass in access for various individuals. So I am very excited today to hear about the ALP, which has been a big part of what we've been discussing for the past past 2 years, really. And we've had the opportunity to present at a couple national conferences. So, Sarah?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Wilds. I have been a PRC consultant for a long time, then did some clinical marketing, and am currently the Vice President of Products and Services for PRC Saltillo. So I'm looking at PRC products, Saltillo products, apps, and the training and implementation support that's provided. I'll introduce Elizabeth by talking about how I met her initially. I was at a conference in Chicago, a rehab conference, and this woman comes up to the PRC booth and looks at our sign and says, "Oh, AAC is what I wanted my entire life's work to be about." So with an intro like that, you can't just let that go very easily. And she and I started talking. She's an OT in Sweden who has spent a good many years, at least more than a decade, looking at how children and adults learn how to use powered mobility. And after researching hundreds of individuals learning how to use powered mobility, she realized that there was a learning process that every person went through. So she developed the assessment of learning process specifically for using powered mobility. And when I saw the chart, which we'll see here in a few minutes, I texted it to Chip, and without either of us talking about it, we both realized this was exactly what the AAC field needed to look at how children and adults learn how to use access technologies with AAC. So the three of us have worked together over the past, I think it's been slightly over 2 years now, and are thrilled that we've come to a place where we have a framework for looking at how to evaluate access in AAC. And as Chip's going to talk about here, we knew that there were problems that needed to be addressed, and this is what got us there.
Got it. Okay. So the problems, as we saw it, was first of all, being able to separate the access issue from the language issue. And it's always been kind of difficult because a lot of what we do with access and access assessment really is wrapped up into the communication system that the individual is working on. So we wanted to have a way to kind of look at the skills very separately you know, to better understand and isolate what those were. The second piece that was very important was, or difficult, is trying to understand the level of performance. You know, even on the group we were just talking about, or the chats were discussing some specific measure, Heidi Kessler's work, others that have very clear measures of what access performance looks like. What we're going to find with the ALP is that there are other characteristics that we can look at that are not just speed and how accurate you are, that can involve other characteristics that become important to understanding how someone is learning the method and how they're actually applying it. So, and there really is today no clear methodology that kind of works for all sorts of groups. And so the ALP somewhat addresses that. The next piece, and to me, that has always been something that I've understood since very early in my career and working in advanced access, for advanced access needs for clients with complex communication needs, is that there is a path for how someone acquires the skill for learning to use an access method. And while I maybe wasn't able to quantify it, and the ALP was able to do that for us, we feel it's important that individuals understand that path, and that we can understand and get that initial baseline, and then set clear goals as how we're going to move forward through that path as we advance. Next, and probably one that we're still learning about and building on with information that we gather for others, is how to apply certain strategies to help someone along this path at the right points. So how to gauge what techniques you're going to use, what type of feedback, is modeling necessary here, or it needs to be more experimentation. And I think this becomes very important in terms of learning and building up those access skills as someone progresses. And then lastly, being able to track progress, and specifically being able to quantify a qualitative view of progress over time. And the ALP allows us to do that, and allows us to look at it at various points. And it's something that we can use on a regular basis to track those learning skills. All right, Sarah?
So when I first met Lizbeth, this is what her ALP instrument looked like. And again, this is for powered mobility. I don't know, Chip, I don't think I can highlight things, but on the far right-hand side, you'll see the stage of performance. So we start at the bottom, because developmentally we start at the bottom and we grow. So the bottom part was how kids and adults are exploring the functions, the body, and their tools in terms of learning that powered mobility. The next stage, broad stage, is explore sequencing, and you add to that how they're learning about the environment that's around them when they are learning to use powered mobility. And the final stage is performance. So in addition to their body, what tools they're using, the environment they're in, they're also looking more specifically at what they're actually doing, what their occupation is with that powered mobility tool. So those are the three broad stages. On the left, you'll see that each of those stages is broken into phases. So there's 3 phases in the first stage, 2 in the second, and 3 in the third. Across the top, you're going to see the areas of kind of, oh, yeah, that's all right. The areas of measurement. So we have attention so we're looking at attention, how that differs from 1 through 8, the activity and the movement, understanding of tool use, what the expressions are used at those different phases, and then finally the interaction and communication. And what Chip and I recognized early on is that this helped us solve a few of those problems that he was talking about before. So this gives a method of assessing. We can look at this, she could look at this with her students using powered mobility and say, oh, they're in ALP phase 3, and that automatically gives folks an idea of what they're doing with that wheelchair. It lets you also see the path, so from 3 progressing to 8, what that would look like. You don't see it on this chart, but she has strategies for improving and going through those phases, those implementation strategies, and that helps guide what strategies to use when. And finally, this would allow us to track progress. So in March, Johnny was in ALP phase 3, but by August, we were progressed to an ALP phase 5. And so it lets us see some quantitative progression of that. So this was the ALP instrument as Lizbeth had initially done it for powered mobility. And when we looked at adapting it for AAC, we made it a little bit different, pulled the stages on the left. So, Yep. Keep going.
All right. So, and I apologize, it looks like we might have a little bit of interference on the screen. If this persists, I'll just quickly restart it. So after just a little bit of editing, a few colors, and you know, we turn over something the OT created, hand it to the speech therapist, and we recreated, actually guys, I'm gonna restart this training. I've got some graphics that are hung up. I am sorry. Real quickly, I'll get this going again. Play from start. Annotate. Clear. There we go. Hopefully we're up and running here. Sorry. This will make for a fun recording.
The most technologically sound of us has tech problems.
There we go. Are we up and running? Are we seeing that?
I am not yet, Chip.
Oh, that's not good. Hold on. Try one last time. Here we go.
And I think if it looks like a Xerox copy of a PowerPoint, we're just going to lean into it and apologize for the
Play from current slide. Are we seeing it now?
yes.
Very good. Okay, so we were able to create, with a little bit of color, a little bit of luck, and a lot of effort, we created this chart, which was really to reflect what we thought how AAC fit in. And this is actually in your handouts that we sent out to you. This is the black and white printout of the assessment of learning process for AAC. You're just seeing a colored version of it here to call out the difference in stages, different stages and phases. We've moved everything over to the left. We've maintained the bottom-up design, and you can clearly see where the areas of assessment are across the top. And I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit for you so we can get a little bit of a better understanding of that. So there are 5 areas. I'm just going to bring these all up. There are 5 areas that we look at when we're trying to assess progress within the ALP and trying to assess progress with the access method. So first of all, we're looking at their activity and movement. And by far, this is the most important area. Their movements can start off being vague, and gradually as they move through the different phases, they're going to work up to a point where they have clear fluidity with their movement. When using the ALP and trying to apply it, activity and movement should set the phase that you're in. That should be, when you look at the characteristics that are listed there, say for a phase 3, and activity movement says their acts can get an anticipated effect, they activate the tool, there's a distinct product, a distinct targeted movement, that activity movement will set the phase that you're within. The others will kind of help set where you are within that phase. Are you high, are you low? So their understanding, do they have an understanding of what they're doing with the access method? Are they going from having no understanding whatsoever to phase 1, or to complete understanding when they reach a phase 8? Attention, and to me, one of the most important characteristics that I see when working with someone who's trying to learn access. Are they distractible or working their way to where they're sustained? To me, if I can work with an individual and maintain their participation in activity for an extended period of time, this is usually a good sign that we're going to be able to work with them to advance their skills with access. Social interaction. One of the most interesting pieces to see change as someone gets more comfortable with their access method is how their social interaction improves. Where initially it may not be a whole lot of social interaction to start, but eventually it becomes fully integrated with what they're doing with that access method. They're talking, asking questions, exchanging back and forth about what their own performance is and their own awareness about what they're doing. And then lastly, expressions and emotions. Some individuals start off very neutral or passive and not really react much to the system at all. Others will become very active and shift how they participate with the access method a lot. One of the key aspects that we look for as well is frustration, because that's a sign of being aware that the access method isn't doing what I expected it to do. Ultimately, we want it to be situationally dependent. We want it to be dependent on what the activity is that they're trying to perform. So the access, I'm going to bring this whole chart up because you have this as the second page of your handout. This is kind of the short summarized version of the ALP for AAC. So you can clearly see on the left-hand side the 3 stages, the 8 phases, and some really layman's terms, or the definitions of each of these phases in layman's terms that make sense for anyone that you're trying to explain this to. This is the chart that I think both Sarah and I would agree is if I was sitting down with a parent trying to explain this process to them, this is the chart that I would use. Stage 1, I'm just going to call a couple things out here just to explain it. Stage 1, this is the introvert stage. So I really want you to think about this stage as where the child is internalizing their overall access control for themselves. That their focus is learning on how to actually make something activate, make it move, shift things around on the screen, direct their eyes. It can start at very novice, where this is entirely new concept for them, Curious novice, where they have basically generated an effect that something has happened, but they're not quite sure why it occurred. And then lastly, a beginner, I've made this happen, and I'm the one causing what's happened here. What's really interesting about stage one, when we look at this, is that it has changed the paradigm, I know from my thinking, in terms of how I view cause and effect. I think we always talk about the cause and effect as being together, and what stage one does for us is allow us to separate that a little bit. So 2, curious novice, is really about generating the effect. And 3, beginner, is getting that causality that I actually made that happen. This is important because it allows you to break down a skill that we've taken for granted that actually happens together. And I would tell you that effect really does happen before you understand the causality. So this is a very interesting piece, because in terms of access learning, we have a good number of clients that are in this stage for a very long period of time. Stage 2 is where we begin to transition the access skill that we're developing and begin to learn how to apply it to, in the case of AAC, for communication and ultimately language. So at advanced beginner, you're basically repeating the skill, you're starting to apply it and use it a little bit more often, and you're shifting a little bit of your attention between individuals you might be interacting with and the activity itself. But you're making basic selections and targeting with whatever access method you're using. At sophisticated beginner, this is where sequencing becomes a little bit more apparent. And I'm not talking about linguistic sequencing like you would have in MinSpeak or Unity or in LAMP. What I'm talking about here is sequencing of motor movements and being able to repeat them or move through the interface in a couple different ways. Even early navigation will begin to appear to take place around this stage 4 to 5 transition. So this is when you're beginning to put this together and transition of just learning the access method and applying it to the sequencing side. In stage 3, which I always comment on, this is kind of my favorite, this is where you get some users that are clearly competent with what they're doing. They've advanced their skills with the access method, and now they're trying to find a way to actually apply it. So at 6, competent, they understand how to communicate with it, but a lot of times they're making lots of mistakes, but they're becoming more aware of them. They might ignore them, they might barrel through them, but they are definitely becoming a little bit more aware, and this is a very significant teaching moment in terms of being able to refine their skills. At proficient, they're using it fluently, but they're doing it for one singular purpose. And at 8, expert, this is where now you can take the skills you've been developing with the access method and begin to apply it to other tasks. And so whether you're going to use to learn how to do it for computer access or working a telephone or environmental control, this is where you're beginning to use it in different ways and apply some of those skills that you had. So stage 3 is really a refinement. And when you look at someone who's in stage 3, they're just literally using this in a very natural way, but barely any effort barely any effort around the access method itself. There are questions or?
I have not received any questions on my end.
Okay.
Anybody have, if we pause for a second, if anybody has a question, we're happy to unmute you, or you can shoot it through chat. So this is the really broad overview of these stages. Hopefully you're seeing how it goes from basic to more advanced and gives you some kind of quantitative way to measure. When Chip and I do longer presentations, we do lots of videos, demonstration of what these stages look like, have the participants
rate them.
Yeah, rate them. And what we've found, although we're looking more into this research-wise, is that even with a really basic introduction, folks are able to rate them very similarly. So that's exciting.
All right, well, if there's no questions, I've got the chat just peeking here. I'm gonna keep moving on. Make sure we've got control. Good. So the next piece to this that becomes very important is really understanding that the therapy, that the interventions that are taking place, these are really happening in what we call a transition. So transitioning from what's phase 1 to phase 2, transitioning from phase 2 to phase 3, and advancing as you go through. So if you look at each of these transitions, specifically for phase 1, your first goal when working with the access method is really building their attention to it, getting them to watch what's happening on the screen. At phase 2 to 3, a transition from 2 to 3, we are now working on cause and effect, or as I would rather say, effect and then cause. So we're trying to build up their intentionality of their response, their ability to direct the access method to an intended target. And really the important thing at the end of 3 that we want to see is we want to see intentionality to what they're doing, that they're making a purposeful movement to a target that they would like to communicate or access or use, that there really is a directed response to something with meaning. At 4 to 5, we begin to make this transition, as I said earlier, into targeting for early sequencing. Largely, I would think of this transition as where we're learning how to use single hit types of interfaces, but it can also be the start of using more language-driven interfaces of where you're going to use some type of sequencing to move through it. From 5 to 6, now we're using sequencing and accessing multiple functions, whether this be spelling or whether this is going to be an icon sequencing based system, or whether I'm going to be moving through lots of pages. This is where clearly you're able to sequence and advance through there. 6 is another, and as I called this out earlier, is another very significant stage, because this is where frustration really begins to come in, that they try and do something and they're not successful at implementing it. So now is where we start to look at the movements and try and figure out, and teach them about what they're doing and kind of refining this up. This is leading into that stage 3 piece of where we're refining the skills. And lastly, at the 6 to 7, we're looking at trying to give them more functions and more refinement to what they're doing. And then lastly, we're trying to apply to other tasks. So we're giving them more things to do when we get to the 7 and 8 transition. What also is important about this are the types of activities that we target when going through these transitions. So for the very earliest transitions, 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, I would look at these activities as being very participatory. So I would want games here and very easy communication interactions that basically are requests, or maybe even some simple choice making at most towards the end of 2 and 3. But I want this to be the simplest and error-free type of activities that we can do, that they're just trying to understand their basic control of how they're operating that access method. When they get to 2 to 3 and the movement becomes purposeful, then we can start to shift the communication. And if you notice here, we actually pull communication all the way up to 7 and 8. And this is a clear acknowledgement that methods such as pod, some page-based and social created pages, custom page sets, even ones that are pre-made by the manufacturer, you can have someone that achieves a 7 and 8 level, but may not necessarily be using a formal language system. So I think this is safe to acknowledge that someone could multitask with their device, but at a communicative level, they may be just using it for situational or structured communication interactions. Language begins to emerge as we get to, in that transition from 3, 4, 4, 5, right in there, language begins to slide in at stage 2. And the reason that we push it out this far and not call it off as earlier is because language requires motor sequencing. Think about it. Even if it's the speech mechanism, we are still learning to sequence motor movements. And it also requires more units for symbolizing. So you have to be able to go through multiple targets. So language really begins to emerge as we get past those cause and effect activities, as we see intentionality to the response, then we can begin to apply a little bit more of a language interface to build from. This isn't to say that we aren't working on the earliest of language skills right from the start, but we're shaping our activities and we're changing the purpose of our activities a little bit as we see more refinement in and around the access method. I am going to open this up to some questions, because usually this will generate some comment, or it may not.
Got nothing on the chat window.
Oh God, don't disappoint me, guys. It's lunchtime. It's easy. You can chat. You don't even need to talk. If not, we shall keep going. All right, we're going to keep on going. So the next piece to this.
Hold on, Chip. And Angela did not disappoint. So she says, so determining, quote, language is wide open with these kiddos.
You mean in terms of, Angela, I'm just going to come back with a quick question. Do you mean in terms of the actual language system used? That is, yeah, where they are, I can see it. Yeah, so where they are receptively, absolutely. There's a wide open range here of what could happen. There's also these kiddos that we work with that receptively may be really struggling with their access method. Yeah, to get into some specific tools to determine, that's where let's look at this next step to kind of see if I can explain this a little bit more around a specific access method. And this probably begs into the larger conversation of how the two fit together between understanding that language level and then understanding, you know, where there might be some more disparity in receptive and express, or receptive and the access method getting in the way. So, all right, so we'll have to kind of somewhat table that, but maybe I address it here. So what I'm going to show you here is kind of taking something, and we'll take eye tracking since this has been kind of the basis for a lot of the discussion. Some of the discussion, it was nice to see switches getting recognition on the SIG group. But this is how we take something like eye tracking and apply it to these different transition stages and the strategies and activities you might be using. So the general strategies that you would apply for someone in stage 1 are basically the same. So things like increasing pause time, maintaining vigilance to activity. And what that means is that you're paying attention to the individual very closely and making sure that that they're engaging, look at their attention, that they're experimenting a little bit, and if they're not, being able to facilitate that. But you have to pay attention to what's happening very closely, because things that can change can be very, very subtle. We want to encourage and embrace a slow pace of work, but we also want to get work to happen at brief periods for as much intensity as that they can handle. So we want to keep them working for as long as the period is possible. One of the most unique things that I found, and got to see this really work more than I would have ever thought, was the labeling of body parts, as opposed to saying hit the switch, saying that's a great way to use your head, or reinforcing that they're using their finger, and actually becomes kind of a prompt for you know, eliciting the response that we're looking for with the access method. So labeling the body part that you're using for control. And then lastly, the focus on stage 1, it's about exploration. Remember, we're trying to get them to internalize what that movement's going to be at this stage. We're not necessarily trying to apply it to lots of things. We're trying to generalize it and get them to understand that they have this control. So if we were to look at specific activities where we want to look at how this movement shifts, in the transition stages of 1 to 2, I want to look at their movement. I want to see what their mouse over control looks like, or I want to see them use mouse over activities where they just move over something and you know, activate it on the screen. Having them watch a video and just seeing if they can pay attention to what's going on the screen, or getting some basic auditory or visual stimulus as they're moving around the screen, but using lots of error-free activities here. In 2 to 3, we might start to emerge with some clear targets that have a more distinct reward, and start to look for some preference-driven activities here, because now we're moving from just having that effect to looking at cause and effect. In prior stage activity, and we can also bring up some of the prior stage activities, but shrink their target size and make it more of a distinct and isolated target. The whole time here, we're starting with something very broad with their movements, but at the same time, we might be using the same activity and just shrinking the area a little bit to make them get down to a more specific target. Lastly, when we get to 3 to 4, we're increasing the number of targets on the screen. We're looking for more of that purposeful movement, which is really going to lead to that activation that we'd want to see for communication. We can increase the number of targets, we can increase the complexity of the background, and start to bring in more figure ground discrimination as we're advancing. If we move to, you silly computer. If we move to stage 2, I'm just going to keep barreling forward here. We need to focus our attention on the AAC tool. So now we're looking at the implementation of it and how we're going to use it. We allow more trial and error to occur, but we're also involving them in the process, giving them some feedback as to what they're doing and how they're working with that access method. And then lastly, we're trying to adjust the visual display for that just right level. Sarah's got stories of this. I have stories of this, of where we see someone start off with an access method, and the first thing that our instinct is, as speech pathologists, to do is to ramp up the amount of language that we present them, because we see some basic control. And often we get too much too fast too soon, and what happens is their skills actually slide backwards and they don't have that control that we were hoping to see. So finding that just right level, that quote unquote Goldilocks level of what we can present on the screen and still maintain a consistent level of access becomes important. But then we can start to progress forward and make more of a gradual transition in terms of how we represent things on the screen. And then lastly, the focus here is on communication and language. So we're trying to build that up more here and less so around the access method itself. As far as the activity types, we actually begin to look at activities that require more than just one step. We begin to focus more on very discrete target selection. So just as an example, I might have 20 potential targets on the screen, but I might only reveal 15 of them or 10 of them to make them, to look for more of a distinct targeting. We're going to adjust timing. We're going to work on fixation. We're going to look for greater precision in what they're doing. At the same time, try and increasing that cognitive load as we move from stages 4 to 5. In stages 5 to 6, we are now looking at full implementation of the language system. We still may be regulating some content so it doesn't get overwhelming, and then refining those timings and fixations so we can access things with greater precision. And again, as just in the prior one, we continue to increase the cognitive load, whether they be games or the amount of communication and language that they have access to. Lastly, in stage 3, oh, this one's so shredded up. We kind of let more mistakes occur, but we're also trying to refine their skills a little bit and calling out those mistakes, getting lots of improvement looking for lots of improvement in and around the functions that they're doing. What we want to do is to motivate them to use more of it is actually not just trying to refine it with more communication language, but give them more function and control over their system. So in essence, allowing that early multitasking to take place. And then lastly, I know it's blurred out here, is that we want to get as much engagement at the highest level we possibly can. So sometimes the pace gets very quick. We wind up doing lots of repetitive things to make sure that they've got the control, but then we just give them lots more that we can do. As far as being able to adjust the activity types, full implementation of the language system occurs here, and games and the language system itself are requiring many more steps and selections to complete whatever that activity is. And then from 7 to 8, now we are looking for control outside of the system, and we're looking at mouse control over the operating system in itself. Are there questions on these activities before I move this forward?
Chip, there was a question from Angela that I was typing to you, and then I'll just say it in voice. She asked about whether we have videos of things to observe from the client so we don't miss the cues. We do have some fairly good videos. The ones that I like even more are the ones that show strategies that the therapists use and how the kids respond to them. As Chip said, cueing such as, identifying a body part, which is something that I probably hadn't thought of as much before doing the ALP. Unfortunately, we don't have permission to share those videos outside of a in-person class, so we can't show them here.
So what we do have, Angela, and I think you'll see us we'll try and find a way to get these out, as well as some of the other ones that we're kind of locked in on our permissions right now. Have been able to isolate specific skills, like when someone adds too much visual display, what that does to the access method and what their control looks like. And we've done this both in a gaming environment and in a communication language environment. So, both with the facilitating strategies that people use and in the configuration for the devices, we've been able to isolate a few of these skills. The one stage that we've gotten really good video documentation around has been in the third stage, and looking at that refinement and seeing what that looks like over time for some individuals. So we've had some good luck there. But yeah, I think that is something that we definitely need to kind of show, what those look like, because sometimes it's very, very subtle. Even in watching some of the videos multiple times, I still go back and I see some things that change my view on it. So the last piece that I want to show you here, the last two pieces of this that I want to show you, are things that can affect progress and how you track someone on the ALP. And the thing with the ALP is it's not that you're just moving up and you don't move down. Kids who have advanced or complex communication needs move up and down on the ALP scale all the time. And that's the point, because sometimes it can be subtle, sometimes it can be more overt. You have a kiddo that's doing great, has a seizure, and you want to go ahead and see what they're doing with their access method again, and you look at it and you see a completely different individual. The ALP allows you to kind of quantify what the impact of that was and to see the changes that took place, which may cause you to make certain adjustments while they shifted down to these lower levels. It might not, but it maybe make you a little bit more aware of how the presentation of whatever you're trying to control is. So you might make some adjustments to help them. So things that can affect progress: one, the technical setup of the device. They've got to be able to technically, use the system, connect. Their eyes need to be tracking before we can even start. So I call that out because I have seen a number of situations where this is a problem. Second is any changes in medical, physical, or cognitive status. Meds, I have had some very subtle effects there, specifically oral baclofen. Seizure activity is another one that could change things. Just overall general health, having a cold, having a fever, that can cause a shift in any of these statuses. You might see that impact on some of the areas of what we're measuring on the ALP in a way that you wouldn't necessarily, be tracking or looking for. Another thing that can impact it, and we were talking about this earlier, is that mismatch between the strategies that you're using and the stage of access that they are. Maybe giving too much feedback and not allowing enough exploration, or not providing enough feedback and not giving that refinement that they need when they get to their higher stages. And then lastly, a mismatch between the activities and the stage of access. And this can also be too much information that's being presented too soon. So there are a number of things here that the activity might be too complex and we might need to look at something simpler, or vice versa. We may not be complex enough and they're at a much higher stage of access. And we've been able to capture that in a number of videos that we have. Hopefully that's something we can make available soon. So where do we go from here? I'll turn it over to you, Sarah, and then we'll take questions.
Yep. Okay, so where we go from here, there's 4 major components that we're looking at over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. So as you can see, although this is, Chip and I have close associations with PRC and Saltillo, it is a program that can be used across AAC devices and computer access devices and low tech, just about access. Okay, so the 4 areas that we're looking at specifically, the first one is research. So we've partnered with West Virginia University. They've been wonderful partners with us since the beginning. Oops, I'm sorry, somebody's phone is unmuted. Right. I didn't say that before. Right. On the phone. Right.
So it would have to be the hospital.
I don't know if you can mute that person.
Oh, Sarah, hang on. I muted you.
All right, I think I got it. Okay. I'm going to go back one more. We can leave that up. That's fine. So research, we're partnering with WVU and looking at the reliability of the ALP and make sure that if we give quick instructions that folks are able to reliably rate those users. The second one is we're working on making sure this is accessible to folks in the form of a website with information on there, downloadable forms, maybe a place for question and answers. So that is in the works. We're looking at longitudinal videos. So those of you who've been to one of our presentations at ASHA or ATIA have seen the video of Nadia, which is a great clip of a girl. I think she starts at about 23 months. Is that right, Chip?
Yes.
And she is learning powered mobility. So at 23 months has absolutely no idea what this wheelchair is about or what this joystick is. And then by the time we see her towards the end, several years later, she's navigating a hallway backwards and using sign language simultaneously. So a great, just a longitudinal video. We need to do more of that with AAC. As all of you who work in the field know, sometimes those longitudinal videos just A, take a long time, and B, are tricky to get. And the fourth one is increasing the clinical information that we have available, the information on strategies, which is in the works, but still not as robust as we would like them to be, and specific strategies for different access methods. So we know a strategy for switches, for example, is to label that body part that's activating the switch. We want to be able to do other access-specific strategies as well. So that's where we go from here. On the screen, you'll see our contact information. We're also working on private classes for school teams, for regional associations, etc. So if there's a presentation that you would like to see, we're in the details, still in the details, and don't really have it fully fleshed out, but we'd be happy to chat with you about what that might look like. So any questions that we can answer in the last couple minutes that we have scheduled? Oh, Chip, one private question did come into me, which was basically a lot of the kids that this person sees are at that early 1 and 2 stage of ALP, and how does that relate to funding requirements that often require demonstration? I know we get this at every presentation. I think our answer has evolved, but that require more advanced forms of communication before a device is funded.
This is a really complex answer, and a lot of it has to do with the diagnosis of the individual, the funding source in itself, and what their tolerance level is. And then also, have we evaluated and clearly established that, that the access method, is applicable, that we've evaluated other access methods. It's a very long answer. Stage 1, I think that's very difficult to make a funding case for. But at phase 1, I think it's very difficult to make that recommendation. But at phase 2, I believe you can with some diagnoses. And the rationale is if the simple way I put this is if not, then what? So, if there is no other way that they are going to physically be able to control something, then some of these early documented skills that we know exist become what we are focusing on to develop basic communication. They can't communicate if they don't have a way to do it consistently, and they have no chance of learning language if they don't get a consistent movement. So we have to develop that motorically first. It goes outside the scope of normally what we think with AAC, but this is, it's a much, much bigger question than I probably can answer in 2 minutes. So.
The other thing that we've talked about before is using different types of activities to illustrate different things. So for example, if the goal is that you're using more to request continuation of an activity, that might be your communication goal, but your access goal might be that there is that one button on a screen and they're, finding it with their eyes and learning that concept. So there's other ways as well. All right, we're gonna keep this right at the 45 minutes. Sorry about our technical difficulties and what looks like old Xerox slides. I can assure you they're crisp and clean. But thank you all for coming, and we appreciate your interest in the ALP for AAC.